Hello and welcome back to Chit Heads. I'm Khalid, one of the learning navigators at Embodied Philosophy, and I'm here to open up this episode. This episode is a talk with Edwin Bryant, republished from Embodied Philosophy's Radical Practice Conference in 2018. If you have a copy of the Bhagavad Gītā handy, you might want to grab it while you listen. Edwin Bryant received his PhD in Indic languages and cultures from Columbia University, and is presently the professor of Hinduism at Rutgers University. He has received numerous awards and fellowships, published 8 books, and authored a number of articles on the earliest origins of the Vedic culture, yoga philosophy, and the Krishna tradition. As a personal practitioner of Bhakti yoga for over 45 years, a number of them spent in India studying with traditional teachers, where he returns yearly, Edwin strives to combine academic scholarship and rigor with appreciation towards traditional knowledge systems. In this episode, Edwin talks about Patañjali's citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ type practice in the Gītā, Ashtanga-type practice in the Gītā in comparison with verses in Patañjali, and Bhakti, the highest expression of yoga. We hope you enjoy.
Om Jnana-timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Umilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Akandamandalakaram Yena Vyaptam Characharam Tatpadam Darshitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Apavitra Pavitrova Sarvavastha Gatopiva Yasmaret Pundarika Ksham Sa Bhaya Bhyantara Shuchihi. So, traditional teaching, one always typically begins anyway with an invocation. When we invoke the presence of our teachers and we invoke the presence of Ishvara to guide our and inspire dhimahi, to inspire our intelligence. So our project today is to look at the Ashtanga, although the Gītā doesn't use the term Ashtanga, but to look at the Gīta's articulation or expression of what it calls dhyana yoga, which is the sort of the equivalent of Patañjali in yoga, the citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ yoga. So actually even Patanjali doesn't call it Ashtanga, he just says it has Ashtangas, it has 8 limbs. But anyway, the term in the older texts, and texts like the Gītā, for that type of practice is called dhyana yoga, which of course in Patanjali is the 7th limb, but in the older texts, dhyana yoga is the name for meditational yoga, the citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ, meaning the stilling of the mind type of yoga. So our project is going to be to look at how the Gītā defines yoga. First of all, the Gītā is not going to reject that kind of yoga at all. It's going to honor it and respect it, but it's not. Krishna certainly is going to take the position that he doesn't favor that, at least for Arjuna, in Arjuna's case. And he's going to make the case that there's another type of yoga. So we'll look at those so-called 2 types of yoga. Actually, the Gītā, people say that the Gītā has these 3 yogas. The Gītā itself never talks about having 3 yogas. Of course, there's bhakti and there's karma and there's jnana and so forth. It never sort of articulates the view that there are these 3 yogas, although that does come in the commentaries many centuries, starting from many centuries ago. But the Gītā itself does explicitly recognize 2 kinds of yogas. So we'll look at the verses where that is the case, where Krishna states that, and we'll look at the sort of different emphases of these 2 kinds of yogas. And then hopefully, if we have time, we'll at least say something about bhakti, which of course in the Gītā is, these yogas are not equal. Bhakti is the culminating, the highest expression of yoga, and the Gītā is very clear about this. So we'll look at those verses so that we can look at the text itself. So if those of you listening or watching this podcast, is it a podcast? This video, if you have a Gītā handy, you might want to grab it. I recommend Winthrop Sargent. This, because it has the Sanskrit, it does not have a commentary. Now, not that there's anything wrong with commentaries. Commentaries, of course, are an essential part of the study of any text in India. But the issue with the commentaries on the Gītā is actually a Vedanta text. It's one of the three texts that is used by the Vedanta tradition, along with the Upanishads and the Vedanta Sutras themselves. So the Gītā is like the third text. That's called the Prasthana-traya, the three texts. And I won't call it a problem, but certainly the issue or the characteristic of Vedanta is that it becomes very sectarian, and the commentaries differ radically amongst themselves. And we don't have time to get into that. I think many people watching this might not be that so interested in that. But I mention it because since we don't want to get involved in that, then this Winthrop Sargent doesn't have a commentary. It has the Sanskrit word for word, and that way, even if you're not planning to learn Sanskrit, you can really get close to the text. And then you see what the actual text is saying, and then read the commentaries and compare. And then you'll see that many translations take enormous liberties in the translation. That's just the nature of Vedanta. So, the Gītā then, it's probably worth noting, it's not a text unto itself. It's actually been plucked out of the Mahabharata, a huge text, the biggest literary epic known to man, that has been preserved. 100,000 verses with 4 lines, so it's enormous. And the Gītā is situated right in the middle, and this huge epic dealing with the saga of the Pandavas and the Kauravas. It's a warrior epic, and it's meant for warriors. In fact, the beginning of the Mahabharata, Vyasa says this is meant for non-Brahmins, those who normally would not have access to Brahminical knowledge, high knowledge, scholastic learning. And he mentions, the warriors and the merchants and women as well. So those who are normally excluded from Vedic orthodoxy and orthopraxy, the Mahabharata is written for them. So it's a warrior text, and therefore the language is very martial. And those who have read the Gītā might have remarked on that. And that's because it has been plucked out of a huge martial epic, a huge war that took place, according to tradition in the ancient past. So the first chapter of Gītā then was the battlefields, the lines on both sides are described on the battlefield. Various warriors are named, of course. If you'd read the entire first half of the epic, because the Gītā comes right in the middle, then you'd know who all those warriors were and their stories and all about their kingdoms. Of course, we are artificially just jumping into the Gītā. So the first chapter is just a list of names for us, but actually, if you read the Mahabharata, they all have their dynastic histories and their stories and so forth. So the battle is about to start. It's considered to be a righteous war by the standards of the time, the Dharma Shastras, according to the standards of the conventions of the time, just like we have our Geneva Conventions, or they have their Dharma Shastras, which expressed when war is a righteous thing to engage in. So all of that's been discussed in the first 50,000 verses. War looms inevitable. Krishna is Arjuna's charioteer for reasons that we don't need to get into. Battle is about to start. And Arjuna asks Krishna to bring his chariot between the lines. He sees on the opposing side all the sort of family and friends and so forth, but 2 people in particular are there. Of course, he's known all along they're there, but now he suddenly realized the implication of this. And that is Bhishma, the grand Pitamaha, the grandfather, technically granduncle, is on the other side. And he's, of course, the grandfather of both groups of cousins. And Drona, the guru. So to get a sense of this, we might like to recall that the Pandavas were orphans. So Bhishma was, even though biologically was the granduncle, was actually like the father figure, the presence, the paternal presence. So he's there on the other side, not because of any animosity to the Pandavas, but just because of the quirks of warrior protocol. So warriors were on one side or the other, simply because of sort of Indo-European kind of warrior ethic. If somebody asked you nicely to fight on their side, that's all you basically had to do. If you got there first, then and asked the king, then the king would fight on your side. If the other side got there first and asked politely, then he'd be on the other side. It had nothing to do necessarily with partiality. So this is a feature of not just the Indian tradition, but you see that in other Indo-European warrior traditions. Anyway, so the point is they're on the other side not because of any partiality. And when Arjuna realizes that he's going to have to fight his father figure, his grandfather Bhishma, and his guru, he has a conflict of dharma. And this is what triggers the Bhagavad Gītā. It's not an existential crisis. Okay, we should be clear about that. Arjuna's not asking the big existential questions that perhaps the Upanishads are asking, and other texts like who am I, and why, what happens after death, and those kinds of questions. I mean, Krishna of course does disclose all of that, but that's not what Arjuna is asking. So the real the teachings of the Gītā, if we want to think of the yoga teachings of the Gītā, begin 2:11, and they're preceded by Arjuna saying, Dharma. Excuse me. I thought I was going to sneeze. Dharma samudha chetaha. My mind is confused about dharma. Dharma samudha cheta. Samudha, confusion. Dharma samudha chetaha. My chitta. It's confused about dharma. Shishaste shadhimam tvam prapanam. And he says, that's it. I'm so confused. Just tell me what to do. I'm now your disciple. The relationship changes then. They're no longer equal, sort of cousins. They're equal in a social sense, although of course Arjuna's always revered Krishna. But it changes at that moment. I think that's 2:7 or thereabouts. 2:7, and Arjuna becomes a disciple, and then and his confusion is a dharmic one. Okay, so that's the point. That's important at this point. So then Krishna launches into what's sometimes called the Jnana Yoga portion of the Gītā. Well, the Gītā itself calls it Sankhya Yoga, as we will see. And he starts off, and I'm just going to... The Gītā is a very, very busy text. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of verses that are kind of dismissive of Vedic ritualism. That's kind of like a sub-agenda of the Gītā. To be not rejecting Vedic ritualism, but dismissive of how it's... the attitude with which it's performed. And Gītā and Krishna's really sort of referring to a lot of things that are going on in the intellectual landscape of the day. Okay, Sankhya and the Guna theory and Jnana Yoga and Vedanta. There's verses that are verbatim from the Upanishads, a couple of verses. Vedic ritualism, yoga practice. So basically it's sort of referring to all of this and subsuming it all under Bhakti. That's the ultimate agenda of the text. Now, our discussion today is not going to be so much on Bhakti, but I do want to throw that out right at the beginning, that really its primary agenda is to say that Bhakti is the highest path. Bhakti Yoga is the highest type of yoga, and there are a number of verses where this is clearly expressed. In the 12th chapter, beginning, Arjuna clearly asks Krishna which is the highest yoga. End of chapter 6, again, highest yoga is Bhakti. So let's establish that, even as that's not going to be our focus in this particular talk. So the so-called Jnana Yoga portion of the Gītā then, the verses are essentially a lot of the adjectives, a lot of the phraseology is coming from the Upanishads. The Upanishads are the Jnana texts, which are also busy texts, but one of the main sort of features of the Upanishads is the instruction on Brahman and Atman. It's not the only one. There's a lot going on in there. But anyway, from the point of view of the Vedanta tradition, the main agenda of the Upanishads is to teach Atman and Brahman, even though academic scholars will point out, well, actually there's a lot of other stuff going on, and that's fair enough. But from the point of view of the Vedanta tradition, okay, which Vedanta Sutra starts with Badarayana, the date for Badarayana is eluding me, but I believe it's Vedanta Sutras. I can't remember if it's the 3rd century BC or AD. We're going to have to edit this bit. So, from the point of view of the Vedanta tradition, the main right, Atato Brahma Jignasu, the main purpose of the Upanishads is to teach about Brahman. So the Gītā wants to connect to that. Because why? The reason the Gītā wants to connect to that is because it's actually going to, it itself is going to say it's introducing a new type of yoga, although it says it actually was old but got lost. But to all intents and purposes, at the time, it's a new type. Even if it was a reintroduction, it was new from the sensitivities of the day. So Krishna wants to say, it's the same Upanishadic teaching, but I'm just going to show you how to do that in the context of action in the world. So therefore there are, the first, chapter 2, a lot of the phraseologies, so for example verse 18, let's start, verse 18, these bodies inhabited by the eternal, the indestructible, the immeasurable, embodied self are said to come to an end. So that kind of language is fairly typical of the Upanishads, that there is an Atman, that is indestructible, that is eternal, and immeasurable, it's infinite. Notice these are all negatives. Neti, the Upanishads say neti, because the Atman is beyond the intellect, and the intellect can only conceive of things for which it has samskaras, and those samskara is the product of an imprint that comes from Prakriti. So in other words, we can only think of things for which a thought is an activation of a samskara, and a samskara is an imprint of something that's been received from Prakriti. Even if it's a conceptual thing, it's still a Prakritic thing that's bound by space and time and so forth. As Kant, of course, informed Western philosophy. So therefore, when we talk about the Atman, how we're projecting Prakritic things, any kind of attempt to describe the Atman is going to be projecting Prakritic things, which are inapplicable or inappropriate. They're metaphysically, it's a metaphysical issue, and not just a semantic one, that the mind can only sort of discuss and think about and qualify and describe Prakritic things. And so therefore a lot of the descriptors in the beginning of the Gītā, when I say the beginning, the philosophical portion, which starts at 2.11, are going to be negatives, negating that it's not measurable. Everything in Prakriti is measurable. Even the Mahatattva is measurable. Even the universe itself is measurable. There are measurements given in the Puranas, actual measurements. But the Atman is immeasurable. It's indestructible. It's eternal. It has no terminuses. It has no. It's not bound by time. So we'll see a lot of this, and the Upanishads just say, put it very nicely, neti, which means not iti, not this, not this, not this, not this. So we get a lot of neti verses in the beginning of the Jnana Yoga portion of the Gītā, imperishable, and so forth. Okay? So this is, Krishna has to, any kind of yoga is predicated on the notion of an Atman, that there is something beyond the body-mind. And therefore Krishna, the Gītā establishes that first. So Jnana Yoga, in a sense, is the basis of any type of yoga, whether it's Bhakti Yoga, whether it's Karma Yoga, whether it's Jnana Yoga, right? If you're going to citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ, for example, the presupposition, one wouldn't be doing a citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ unless there was a drashtahu svarupe vastanam, the possibility of a drashtasya, a drashtra, drashtahu in the genitive, a drashtu svarupe avasthanam, the possibility of a seer abiding in its own nature. So therefore, even though Patañjali doesn't give us jnana, he's presupposing that there is the mind behind which there is the seer that can abide in its own nature. So therefore, Jnana Yoga is the basis of all the yoga traditions, and that Jnana Yoga is expressed in the Upanishads. And other texts, but especially in the Upanishads, and that's the Vedanta. So Krishna wants to link the Gītā with those Upanishads because he wants to inform Arjuna, and through Arjuna, the reader, that even though this is going to sound new, he's going to talk about acting in the world, it's Upanishadic teachings, but it's going to be tailored, those teachings which are normally forest teachings, and that's why Arjuna is going to keep getting confused at least twice. He's going to say, I'm confused, you're telling me to act, but shouldn't I be not acting, go into the forest? Because typically at that time, when we read the Upanishads, when we read the older Puranic texts, and we see the moksha dharma of the Mahabharata, the older texts, when the term yoga is typically used, and the yogi, it's often in the forest, which is logical, right? If you're seeking the Atman, then you're not seeking the world anymore, and you want to try to avoid all distractions. If you're going to citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ, then you want to put yourself in an environment that's most conducive to that. And so therefore, the Upanishads are typically situated in the forest, even the Brihad-aranyaka, the Aranyaka, the Upanishad, the Aranyaka is a forest. So therefore the practice of yoga and of yogis, you see them in the Mahabharata in the background, when Ram is in the forest, you see them when the Pandavas are in the forest. So the yogis tend to be living in the forest. You certainly see it in the Puranas and so forth. So that tended to be the associations at the time of this thing called yoga. So therefore, Krishna wants to start off by establishing that this is the same Upanishadic teaching. It's not some new, point of view. It's not some new non-Vedic, set of teachings. So therefore, we have all of these verses. The verse 22. The body is compared to a set of clothes, and people just change their clothes. What's the big deal? Put on new clothes. So death is like that. So we have all of these sort of jnana yoga verses, very basic, 101, very sort of basic, you can say, Vedanta teachings. Nothing particularly startling or unique about them. The Gītā is purposely connecting to an established sort of Vedantic point of view. And so this goes on, chapter 25, verse 25, 26, and so forth. Death is certain, birth is certain. We get verse 29, that one can perceive this Atman, and let's keep that in mind, that the purpose is perception of the Atman. I mean, after all, what does Patañjali call the Atman? Sometimes he uses the term Atman, and sometimes Purusha, but often he uses the term Drashtra, the seer. Swarupe vastanam. The seer can see itself, can abide in its own nature. So verse 29 tells us that it's possible to see the Atman, and that ultimately that's the goal. So we get to verse about 239, and then the Gītā, Krishna sort of indicates that it's going to be the transitional verse, and let's read it. So he says, this insight is wisdom, right? And it's declared in the theory of Sankhya. He calls that Sankhya. We should keep in mind now that this is before the emergence of the so-called 6 schools of Indian philosophy. Actually, those schools are enumerated differently in the older sources. There's 12 or 13. So I don't know when the idea of 6 becomes reified, although the number 6 seems to have some kind of history. But anyway, it's something of an artificiality because there's many more than 6 schools. We might know Tantra and so forth, and the Shakta traditions are theologically sophisticated, and they don't make it into the hallowed list of 6. But anyway, this is before that. So Sankhya at this point doesn't refer to a specific school, one of the schools, but it is the term the Gītā uses for Jnana Yoga. So Vedanta and Sankhya seems to be sort of, the terms seem to be a little interchangeable. So he says this insight, which he's just spoken about, that the soul is eternal and imperishable and indestructible and so forth, is wisdom, as declared in the theory of Sankhya. Now hear it as applied to yoga. But we must bear in mind it's going to define yoga very differently. Let's just hold on that. We'll see how it defines yoga. So it's making a contrast in verse 239 between the sort of Vedanta-type teachings, which it calls Sankhya, that the soul is eternal and that the real person is not the body, that the body is external to the Atman, right? Just typical, basic, 101 Vedanta teachings. It's making a distinction between that, which nowadays we call the Jnana Yoga, we might call Jnana Yoga, but the text calls Sankhya. It's making a distinction between that and what it calls yoga. Okay, let's see what this yoga is. But before he launches into that, because it's going to be dealing with action, he wants to make it distinct from Vedic kind of religiosity. And therefore we have verses 41, 42, 43, where there's some pretty strong language, sort of dismissive of the mentality of Vedic ritualism, the mentality of throwing things into the fire to get stuff, because it is based on desire, and it's based on ignorance of the Atman. and it's based on an understanding of the self, that I'm the body-mind, and therefore I'm going to get good things from my body-mind, and let me do these Vedic rituals, so I'll get rain, and the celestials the gods, the devas, will bestow boons upon me in this life, and next life I'll get to go to the celestial realms. So the Gītā is very fairly strongly opposing that mindset, not necessarily the performance of the ritual, but the mindset which Patañjali would say avidya, it comes from a place of ignorance of the Atman. Asmita, the next step, which is ignorance of the Atman. The first step, second step is, if I'm ignorant of the Atman, then what do I think I am? Well, I think I'm this drigdarshana shakti, or ekatmata. I think I'm this body-mind, and the minute I think I'm this body-mind, then how do I find meaning in the world? I try to find happiness through my body-mind, and that's raga-dvesha. So the Gītā shares that view. And therefore, Vedic rituals which are aimed at raga, the satisfaction of desire, are not the goal of life. And the Gītā repeatedly revisits that throughout the text. So it might be useful to keep that in mind. When you're reading the text, you'll find these little kind of dismissive comments. Not rejection, but dismissive comments of the Vedas. Why? Because it's the mainstream religiosity at the time. That's what's going on. That was the standard form of religious practice of the time. And the yoga is going on at the margins of this. I always like to think of it, compare it, with St. Francis and, his sort of, and he was working on the margins of of this larger Catholic Church, which at the time had become very materialistic, perhaps, and lost sight of its sort of simple origins. So yoga is going on the margins, in the forests, and all of it. But the mainstream religion of the day was this kind of Vedic ritualism, which is very lusty and material, and nothing particularly spiritual about it. It's about the good things of life in this world, and going to a better realm, not liberation, but some kind of a better realm, a celestial realm, svarga, in the next life. So therefore, Krishna wants to make a distinction between the kind of action that he's going to teach, which is yoga, to kind of this materialistic religiosity. And if we want to find a parallel in our modern day and age, we might think of going to a church or a synagogue or any place of worship and going and asking for material things, rather than asking for knowledge of the true self, or pure love of God, or the sort of spiritual things, ultimate things. But to go to any place of worship with a mentality of, cure my sickness, or send some financial help, and praying to some kind of higher power, whether it's God or Virgin Mary or the Bodhisattva or whatever it might be, and praying for some material boon. That's what the Gītā is criticizing. And that's exactly what was the mindset of the Vedic ritualists. Maybe the rituals are different, right? We might light candles in front of statues and they pour ghee into fire, but the mentality is the same, which is give me good things in this life, bless me with the good things in this life, and a better place in the next life. And that's not the goal of yoga. The goal of yoga is realization of the self, and of course bhakti is then the relationship of that self with a higher self, which is Ishvara. In the Gītā, that's Krishna. So if you run into these verses that are a little dismissive of the Vedic of Vedicism, of Vedic ritualism, then that's one way of thinking about it. So now Krishna now is ready to define the yoga that he's going to teach, which is different, right, from the Sankhya Jnana Vedanta type, which we're familiar with from the Upanishads, or Arjuna would have been familiar with, the reader's familiar with at that time. And here it is, verse 48 is where we get the definition of yoga. Fixed in yoga, fixed in Buddhi yoga, which means the knowledge of the Atman, right? That's why it's the basis. Karma yoga is predicated on Jnana yoga. To act in the world, one has to know who the actor is, or who the actor is not, actually. And so then fixed in that, so keeping that jnana, right? Normally you go to the forest, fixed in jnana, and then what you do Patañjali and citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ yoga to realize. So you bring the knowledge, okay, I'm the Atman, go to the forest, so if that's the case, then I'm the Atman. If that's the case, then I'm not the body-mind. So let me close down the body-mind so I can realize Atman. That's Patañjali. You pratyahara, involute consciousness, and ultimately, dharana, dhyana, samadhi, all the stages of samadhi, and defined in the second verse as citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ. What is that? It's closing out the world. So that's one thing you can do with jnana, right? And that would be the typical thing, an expected thing to do with jnana if somebody really wanted to know the Atma and they went to the forest. But Krishna is going to teach another thing that you can do with this jnana, and that is act in the world with this jnana. So therefore he starts off verse 48, fixed in yoga, yogastha, kuru karmani, do your actions, sangam chaktva dhananjaya, but give up attachment to the fruits. Asiddhya siddhyo samo bhutva samatvam yoga muchyate. Yoga is equanimity to success or failure. If you're really not attached to the fruits, what does that mean? It's all very well saying, don't be attached to the fruits. Well, if one really isn't attached to the fruits, then there's not going to be this notion of success or failure. One's effort's going to be doing one's duty to the best of one's ability, right? Sort of channeling all one's skills and into the performance of one's dharma. But if one is not attached to the fruit, as long as one is satisfied one's done one's duty, no attachment to so-called success or failure. And if that's the case, that one isn't attached, then the mind isn't going to be happy, sad, because typically we work for a goal. If we get that goal, we're happy, and if we don't get that goal, we're sad. And therefore the result of being attached to the fruit is the mind is constantly happy, sad, oh, this worked out well, yay, okay, that didn't work out, boo. And this is embodied life for most creatures. I'm sure the same applies to animal kingdom and so forth. So if one is genuinely not attached to the fruits of action, the proof of that is samatvam yoga muchyate. Samatva, equanimity, peacefulness, no sense of success or failure. The only concern at this point is, did I do my duty? I did my duty to the best of my ability. The rest is karma. The rest is Ishvara's kripa, the grace of God. But but there is no attachment. Okay, that then is the difference between karma and karma yoga. Normal karma means to do one's duty, but to be attached to the fruits, and that's what plants the seed of karma. With the seed, which Patañjali is going to say is jati ayu bhogaha. The seed comes back in terms of the type of birth that we take, the lifespan we remain in those births, and the bhoga, quality of life. So 48, then we get this new definition of yoga, samatvam yoga muchyate, and it's repeated with some variation in 50, where Krishna says, he whose wisdom is established casts off here in the world both good and evil actions, meaning there's no more karma. If one is detached from the fruits, there are no seeds of karma planted. If there are no seeds, then there's no fruits. So in this world, not in some next world. So the way to stop planting seeds, of course, if you're a yogi, you want to stop, and if you realized that sarvam dukkam, right, this is the big maxim of yoga, 215 in Patañjali, First Noble Truth of Buddhism, sarvam dukkam, that somehow or other we're always frustrated in our attempt to find happiness when we think we're body minds, when we're in a state of ignorance. This happiness eludes us. We're always somehow frustrated. That's the best way of thinking of, one way of thinking of sarvam dukkam. We're constantly frustrated. So so therefore one of the fears is, I don't want to keep perpetuating this sort of state of frustration. I don't want to keep making karma. And action is associated with karma. That's why the yogis go to the forest. They want to be minimalists. They want to stop. They want to give up acting. That's why Patanjali talks about the fourth kind of pranayama. What is that fourth kind? Right? There's the inhalation, exhalation, and retention. What else can you do with the breath? Well, there were some radical yogis wanted to even stop breathing. That's how intensely they wanted to avoid action. Because even breathing is an action. It's disturbing, microbes. It's not anything drastic, but it's still action, which is planting seeds, which means that there are consequences, which means one has to come back. So there were yogis that even stopped. You see images or descriptions of yogis with, nails growing around them, don't even cut their nails. Stopped, underwater. There's a story in the Bhagavatam of Sobhari Muni, went underwater, right? So afraid of action. Let me just, and even in the forest, didn't even want to go to the forest, right? Because maybe the forest, right? There's monkeys, there's distractions, right? There's a danger. He goes underwater and tries to meditate. And of course he opens his eyes and he happens to see two little fishes swimming by and they're mating. And that just, all of his suppressed samskaras immediately are triggered by that, and then he goes off and gets married and has 100 kids. So, but the point is that that's how drastically the yogis were fearful of action. So Krishna says, don't worry. If you do, I'm going to teach you how to act. And in a way that you cast off in this world. Verse 50, and elsewhere he says it will save you from the great fear. That's the fear of this planting seeds, of perpetuating the cycle. So anyway, so 50 then he says, you cast off in this world both good and evil actions, and therefore do this yoga, right? And what is this yoga, right? Verse 48 he said it was samatvam, equanimity in action. Here he says, karma sukhaushalam, it's skill in action, right? Not citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ, it's giving a different definition. It's skill in action. What is that skill? Is acting free of desire, which means free of attachment to the results, which means that whatever results come, samatvam, one's equanimous, one is not happy or sad, because there's no attachment there, it's neutral. That's the skill. And if one can act in the world like that, then there is no karma. And therefore he says, one can be liberated. So verse 51, so those who are established in wisdom, the wise ones who have abandoned the fruit born of action, they've abandoned the fruit, meaning attachment to the fruit's going to come, or not. It's not so much that the fruit's going to, if you act in the world, there's going to be consequences, right? Action is a cause and it's going to generate effects. So effects will come, fruits will come. So the issue isn't that the fruits won't come, but not to be attached. So those who verse 51, those who have abandoned the fruit born of action are freed from the bondage of rebirth. Because they're not the bondage, meaning the seed, if there's a seed, it's bound. Bondage means a seed, right? You plant a seed, it's bound to its fruit. So that's the bondage, that seeds are going to produce consequences, and then when one dies, there's so many unfructified seeds that have not borne their fruit. So that's why that's reincarnation is nothing other than that. So they go to the place that is free from pain. Okay, and later on in the text it's going to define yoga. Third definition of yoga is that which takes you to the place free from pain, free from suffering, the dukkam, which Patañjali and the Gītā and the Buddha say, sarvam is actually everywhere. Everything is dukkam if we're in a state of avidya. Okay, so that's then the Gītā's definition of yoga. But what I want to do primarily in this, whatever's left of this discussion, of this reading, is look at the forest yoga. Okay, but I wanted to make it very clear that Krishna is not prioritizing that. He's not rejecting it at all. He's not dismissive of it either. He is dismissive of Vedic ritualism. He is dismissive and uses quite strong language. He's not dismissive of citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ. For those of you who don't know that term, I've been using it a lot. That's Patañjali defines yoga in the Yoga Sutras as citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ, the stilling of all fluctuations of the chitta, of the mind, the stilling of all thought. That's how yoga is defined in Patañjali. So Krishna then, let's just jump now to, we'll jump backwards and forwards a bit because I want to make sure I get everything into this, and there is a time limit here, so I want to get the verses that I especially wanted to share today and make sure that we cover those, and then we might come back and jump around and sort of revisit things. But in the fourth chapter, this is the chapter where Krishna reveals who he is. He's Bhagavan, he's God, he's the Ishvara. Bhutanam Ishvaropi San. I am that Ishvara. The Ishvara elsewhere in the text, the Ishvara that the Vedanta speaks about, that, he doesn't say Patañjali, but one might say that Patañjali mentions. Krishna is claiming to be that Ishvara that the ancient texts talk about. He is the composer of the Veda, Vedanta-krit, Vedavid, the knower of the Vedas, and he is the ultimate cause, the Parabrahman, even beyond Brahman, Parabrahman, the supreme Brahman. So the Gītā is clearly a monotheistic text that's promoting Krishna as the ultimate and absolute truth. So we should be clear about that. Or the text is very clear about that, so whether we are or not. So in that beginning of the fourth chapter, where Krishna sort of reveals, begins his revelation of who he is, he says that, well, let's have a quick look. He says in chapter 4:3, he's talking about the karma yoga that he's just been teaching, and he starts off the chapter by saying it was handed down in the ancient days amongst the kings, and he mentions the Raja Rishis, because this is a yoga for kings. Kings have to be active in the world. They have to be exemplars of Dharma, and they have to make sure everybody else is following their Dharma. That's the Dharma of the king. The Dharma of royalty is, in the ideal world, of course, and the Dharma Shastras is to ensure everyone else is following Dharma. So he says this is a yoga that was imparted, evam parampara praptam imam rajarshayo viduhu. It was sort of handed down amongst the Raja Rishis, rajarshayo viduhu. And then he says it was lost. Sakale naha mahata yoga nashta parantapa. The yoga became nashta, it became lost. And then he says in verse 3, and I'm now re-establishing. The lost yoga, of course, is the karma yoga. It had become lost. So the Gītā is actually acknowledging that it's not saying that it's introducing a new yoga, but to all intents and purposes it is. It's sort of acknowledging that. Of course, it says it's not new because it had originally been there, but that was aeons ago. So at the time of Arjuna's time, it was new, even if it did have some ancient pedigree. So the Gītā is acknowledging this is a new. Because you don't find karma yoga in the Upanishads. You don't really find, you maybe find a few lines in the Moksha Dharma that sort of point at a kind of karma yoga type possibility, but you don't get a very elaborate exposition of karma yoga until the Gītā. It's the first time that you get this action in the world yoga, and you certainly don't find it in Patañjali, although there have been some attempts made to sort of try to construe Patañjali as being promoting action in the world, and I think that's going a bit too far. I mean, Patanjali is not incompatible with action in the world. And by the way, if I could just say this, and I've often say this. The way I think about it is Patanjali is what we do at 6 o'clock in the morning in our personal meditative practice. For me, that's when the instructions and the ethos of Patanjali, of that type of practice, is relevant. That's the time in the morning before the world wakes up for citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ practice. So I think of Patanjali as what I do at 6 in the morning, and the Gītā is what I do from 9 to 5. It's maybe a sort of, a cute way of thinking of it. So the Gītā really is about what we do in terms of our lives in the world, our families, our professions, and so forth. So chapter 4, he says it got lost. He's re-establishing it. He says that a couple of times. And so therefore, let's now. So hopefully that's all clear. And that karma yoga later on in the text is going to sort of evolve into bhakti yoga, which is action not just for the dharma, not just for the sake of dharma, but as an offering to God. And I would like to just revisit that at the end of this discussion, just to make sure that sort of ultimate message is clear. So at this point, earlier in the text, there hasn't been a lot of stress on bhakti because the groundwork is being laid, and the groundwork is that there is a soul, it's not the body. That's the Jnana Yoga, or the Gītā called Sankhya Yoga. One can be a yogi in the world, and the way to do that is to act, to do one's duty, and not be attached to the fruits. And the only way to do that is to understand, I'm not the body-mind. The fruits are it's only the body-mind that's receiving the fruits, and that body-mind is never going to be satisfied by any fruit. Krishna's going to say it's like a fire. Desire is like a fire. The more you pour in, the more it burns. It doesn't get satisfied. It might seem logical, right, that if there's a fire and you throw things on it, it seems logical that it will put the fire out, but it doesn't. The fire just consumes it and burns even more burns even more strongly. So, this point in the text, he's not really ready to give a full exposition on Bhakti, because he's placing the groundwork, getting the bricks. He's laying the cornerstones of ingredients that are then going to be fed or culminate or take their highest expression in Bhakti. Okay, so now what I want to do is, even though this isn't not the main agenda of the text, is I actually do want to look at the Patanjalian portion of the text, what I'm calling the Patanjalian type practice of the text. Just so that those of you, I know that in the yoga world, the Yoga Sutras now in the West has become canonical. That's a very modern thing. It was practically an extinct tradition when the British got to India. They couldn't find any living, there had been yogis in the forest, but they couldn't find a living Yoga Sutra teaching tradition. So this now, the fact that the Yoga Sutra has been basically, it was recognized in principle as one of the the six great texts of the six schools, but it wasn't known as teaching it. They were teaching Vedanta, they were teaching Nyaya. Sankhya also become pretty much extinct. So that's been plucked out now because of Krishnamacharya and Shivananda and the great sort of early 20th century figures and their disciples. So now in the West we have this idea, we have this sort of sense that the Yoga Sutras is somehow are canonical texts. And which is fine. I love the text, and it's a great text, but I just want to say that is a modern phenomenon and has a lot to do with Western transplantation. Even the Gītā, well, it was much more central to Hinduism, certainly central to Vedanta, but it wasn't a text for the. I don't know how in some ways it was there, but it too kind of. Let's put it this way: its status was enhanced with, in the ferment of Hindu nationalism and so forth. That's a story for another day. We now have these two texts, and somehow in the West, these have become our canonical texts: the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gītā, and great. That's a wonderful thing. That's the nature of religion. It's always churning. It's always evolving. It's always cross-fertilizing. Nothing wrong with that at all. I'm not in any way critiquing that. But where I am going with this, with the rest of the presentation, is to into the Patanjalian portion of the Gītā, because since the Yoga Sutras has been exported, many people are reading it. I want to sort of draw attention to how the Gītā expresses that same type of practice, even though, and again I'm repeating myself, pedagogy is repetition. Even though that's not the main aim of the text, is not a dhyana practice, although it honors it. And it very much recognizes it as bona fide. Okay, two types of yoga. Gītā is interested in action in the yoga, action in the world yoga. The Patanjalian yoga, the forest yoga, is the other one. And let's go there now. So we'll go to the beginning of page 5 of chapter 5, and the second time Arjuna is confused. He's confused because on the one hand he's getting all this jnana, this knowledge of the Atman, Sankhya knowledge, and on the other hand Krishna is telling him to act, right? It seems contradictory, right? If I'm really Atman, if it's true I'm not the body-mind, if it's true I should be transcending my desires, shouldn't I go to the forest like all the other yogis? But why are you telling me to fight then, this awful war? He asked that question the first verse of chapter 5 and the first verse of chapter 3. Even after all of this lengthy discourse that Krishna's given him, he's still confused. Why is he confused? Because the notion of yoga as being forest was so entrenched at the time. In other words, all those samskaras in his head up to that point, all those samskaras were sort of saying, yoga is forest, what's he talking about acting? Yoga is a forest practice. So even though Krishna's explained everything to him, and repeated it and re-articulated it and said the same thing in different ways, the samskaras that he's carrying in his mind up to that point are so overwhelmingly considering yoga to be a forest practice that he's still confused. So you praise renunciation of action, and again you praise yoga, Krishna. Yoga meaning skill in action, yoga. Which one is the better of the two? Tell this to me Definitely. That's the first verse of chapter 5. And if you go back to chapter 3, let's see what he says there. Almost a very similar type of statement. If it is your conviction that knowledge is better than action, O Krishna, then why do you urge me to engage in this terrible action? So he's asked the same question twice. Okay, and obviously this is rhetorically, the text is implicitly recognizing the novelty of the Karma Yoga teacher, both by having Arjuna phrase his confusion twice, and by Krishna himself saying this new type of yoga is not really new, it's old, but it had become lost. So these are sort of rhetorical devices that the text is using to affirm that typically yoga is forest, but this is a new set of teachings, but it's legitimate, it's authorized, it's bona fide. Okay, so then Krishna says in verse number 2, both renunciation and the yoga of action lead to incomparable bliss. They both take you to that end goal, right? Of the two, however, it's quite clear, the yoga of action is superior to the renunciation of action. So those of you that are studying Patañjali and thinking, oh my God, this sounds so lofty, but I can never do it. I can never citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ. I have too many responsibilities in the world. Then you might be reassured to read this verse where Krishna says they both lead to the same goal, but the yoga in action is actually better. So that's the karma yoga, or he sometimes calls it buddhi yoga. Actually, quite often calls it buddhi yoga. But let's not explore that because we're going to run out of time. So then he goes on, verse 4 of chapter 5. Sankhya and yoga are different. The childish declare. It's childish to think that they're different. Sankhya meaning the jnana yoga, the atma vedanta yoga, and action yoga. The childish think they're different. Not the wise, those who know. Even with one of them practiced correctly, one finds the fruit of both. So they're both legitimate. So the Gītā is by no means rejecting the forest yoga, even as it's prioritizing action yoga. And the wise know that. Chapter 5, verse 5, we're in chapter 5 now. Verse 5, that the place that is attained by the followers of Sankhya is also attained by the followers of yoga. I'm not going to keep repeating this now, okay? Yoga, when the Gītā says yoga, it means action yoga. Sankhya, it means jnana, okay? So that a few times, so hopefully I don't want to be too repetitive. So, the place that is attained by the followers of Sankhya is also attained by the followers of yoga. Sankhya and yoga are one. He who perceives this truly perceives, because they both are going to give realization of the Atman. I was hoping to be able to read actually chapter 5 with you, but we actually have a time limit, so I'm going to jump into chapter 6 and go straight to this dhyana yoga component of the Gītā, where it articulates a practice that is very close. It's clearly drawing from the same set of practices. Patanjali is systematizing, okay? I always think of Patanjali as a systematizer, right? Atha yoga anushasanam. Anu means to continue the teachings of yoga. So this type of yoga is there in the Shvetashvatara, in the Kathopanishad, in the Moksha Dharma, and the Puranas. I mean, when the term yoga is used, typically it has something to do with yamas and niyamas. Typically, it has something to do with breath control and meditation. So there is some commonality in the way the word yoga is used. It's soteriological, it's plugged into a goal of moksha, and the goal of moksha in turn is plugged into the notion that there's suffering, there's sarvam dukkam, right? If one didn't have a sense of sarvam dukkam, why would one seek moksha? Why would one seek? The Vedic ritualists were not seeking moksha, they were seeking sukham. They were seeking sukham, happiness in this world, and sukham in the celestial realm in the next. They had not realized sarvam dukkam, the Vedic ritualists. They hadn't, for them, they didn't accept that, or at least they hadn't been exposed to that, that idea that the moksha traditions are introducing, that actually it's dukkam. It's always, there's always frustration in any attempt to find happiness from a place of avidya, body thinking and body mind. So when the term yoga is used, then it refers to the kind of meditational practices. Patanjali systematizes those, right? Because prior to Patanjali, we have reference, like in the Maitri Upanishads, to six-limbed yoga. Vishnu Purana talks about a five-limbed yoga. So there were variants, right? Because there's no pope that's going to systematize it for all Hindus. different gurus, different teachers, different practitioners articulated it differently, maybe sort of had their own different specific nuances. But typically yoga did mean some connection with yamas and niyamas. The yamas are common to Jainism, Buddhism, even right-handed tantra. And Nyaya defines yoga as that system which teaches yamas and niyamas. So that was part of the generic understanding of yoga, mostly in the ancient texts. It has something to do with, and definitely has something to do with dhyana, or fixing the mind. So here we're going to look at that type of practice, which then Patanjali systematizes. Once he systematizes it, the Yoga Sutras then becomes the canonical text for that, and that only. Okay, if you're interested in how to still the mind to realize that, when you read Patanjali. If you want to interpret the Upanishads and ask questions about the relationship of Atman and Brahman, you don't read Patanjali. You go to the Vedanta Sutras in traditional India. If you're interested in logic and critical and sort of inferential thinking, you read Nyaya Sutras. So different sutras. If you're interested in what your dharma is in the world, you read the Dharma Sutras, Dharma Shastra. So different sutras, and they announce their subject matter in the first verse. Okay, Patanjali says, Atta Yoga Anushasanam. That's all he's going to do. He's not going to teach us how to, the relationship of Atman and Brahman. He's going to teach us yoga, citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ. So typically the first verse of each sutra announces its subject matter, so everybody knows what the text is about, right? The first verse of Vedanta, Atatta Brahma Jignasu. It's going to be about Brahman, a word that Patanjali doesn't use at all. Okay, so therefore different texts are there for different purposes. So that type of yoga that Patanjali is teaching and calling citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ, its nearest equivalent, I think, we can go to chapter 6, verse 8, or actually let's go to verse 10, because we have some limitations of time. Chapter 6, verse 10. The yogin should concentrate constantly, right? Fixing the mind. Yunjita satatam, yunjita. Yunj is the verbal root of the word yoga. Yoga is a noun, a nominal form, and it comes from the Sanskrit root yunj. So here we have another verbal form, yunjita. He should be yogaing, or yunjita, fixing the mind, satatam, constantly. On the self, atmanam, rahasi stitaha, remaining in solitude, rahasi, in a quiet place. That's why the yogis went to the forest. You're not going to do it in the middle of the Jersey Turnpike. Or you could if you're a really advanced yogi, but typically that's going to be distracting. So remaining in solitude, alone, right? No distractions. You don't want any vrittis. With controlled mind, yata chitta. The term yata is a controlled mind. Okay. Nashir aparigraha. There we have it. Aparigraha, free from possession. So we know, those of us that know the Yoga Sutras will recognize aparigraha as one of the yamas. Aparigraha. Parigraha means to grasp, or to parigraha, to grasp, pari, back, to bring, to sort of covet. To use a good old Testament term, to covet. Is parigraha. So aparigraha is not to do that. So verse 10. 11. Establishing a firm seat. Shucho deshe pratishtapya sthiram asanam atmanaha. Those of you familiar with Patanjali will know that the definition of asana in Patanjali is sthiram sukham asanam. We have two of those three words here in verse 11. Sthiram asanam. He doesn't say sukham, but it's implied. Okay? And it means a seat. Asana is a seat. You sit down. An asana is a seat. This is an asana I'm sitting on. So in a clean place, sthiram sukham, sthiram asanam atmanaha. Not too high, not too low. Covered with a cloth, an antelope skin, and kusha grass. Kusha grass is the sacred seat of the old Vedic ritualists. So there's some continuity, in that sense, at least in the seat. Why an antelope skin? I've looked at this in a few commentaries. I need to look at a few more. I never got a particularly good answer to that. I think there's one commentary says, but I think it's a modern commentary that says that the antelope skin keeps the bugs away. So that's a sort of very modern way of thinking of it. Perhaps, I don't know. Actually, if you look at some of the oldest pictures of yogis, I think they don't go back much before the 16th, 17th century, but often the old pictures you'll see them sitting on an antelope skin. So, and not, you need to do a bit more research and see if any commentary explains that. Where does it come from? How does the yogi get it? Obviously, the yogi's not going to kill an antelope, so it must be a dead antelope. But I mean, is he going to skin it? I mean, of course, these are questions that one might ask, but the commentators don't seem to ask those questions. But I need to rummage about a bit more. But there it is, verse 11, an antelope skin. Okay. Having directed his mind to a single object, right? Patanjali calls that the alambana. With his thought and the activity of the senses controlled, right? Pratyahara. Seating himself on the seat, the yogi should practice yoga for the purpose of self-purification, right? Atma shuddhaye. And this is a term that Patanjali uses, actually, shuddha. That the Atma is well, he says shuchi, but somewhere he calls it shuddha. I'll have to find the verse. The mind. So by practicing pranayama and the mantra and meditation, and the mind becomes sattvic, and the mind needs to be completely and utterly sattvic in order to be still, because vritti is rajas. When there's rajas, there will be thought. So thinking is a product of sort of a subtle type of mental rajas. So for the mind to be completely and utterly in a state of nirodha, that's synonymous with saying it has to be 100% sattvic. And so the practices then are sattvicizing the mind. Verse 13, holding the body, head and neck erect, motionless and steady, gazing at the tip of his own nose. And in chapter 5, the tip could be here, but in chapter 5 it says this is the tip, between the eyebrows. So you concentrate on this point here, and I think at least one commentator says the reason for that is if your eyes are open, it's easy to get distracted. If your eyes are closed, then of course closing the eyes, the tamasic samskaras associate that with sleep, so the tamas is going to arise in the mind when the eyes are closed, and so therefore you don't want to be distracted or trigger sleep impulses, and therefore you keep the eyes open but unfocused. So that would be the tip of the nose, not looking in any direction. Verse 14, with quieted mind, banishing fear, establishing the brahmacharin vow of celibacy. Brahmacharya, citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ, the vrat of brahmacharya. So as we know, that's the one of the yamas in Patanjali is brahmacharya. So here it is, establishing brahmacharya, controlling the mind with thoughts fixed on me. So here we have a theistic element. Krishna's saying this, fixing the thought on Ishvara, Krishna. Patanjali's going to allow this too. He's going to say you can fix the mind on Ishvara, Ishvara pranidhana dva. How do you do that? Tasya vācaka pranābhaha tajapa tadartha bhavanam. That Ishvara manifests, the vācaka of Ishvara, the Ishvara manifests in the form of pranava, Om. Tajapa, and you do the japa of Om. So this is the most common form, at least in Hinduism and perhaps a lot of early Buddhism and other traditions, is fixing the mind on a sort of sonic incarnation, the divinity manifest in the form of sound, the alambana, right? Because if you citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ, mind has to be fixed on something. And that thing is the alambana. Patanjali, he says, yata abhimata, you fix it on anything you want, but clearly he's prioritizing Ishvara because he spends 5 or 6 verses, beginning of the list of alambanas. Ishvara is there in the beginning, and he has 5 or 6 verses. Whereas other alambanas, alambana being the support of the mind, have only 1. So here Krishna is saying the same thing, fix the mind on him, but it has to be fixed. And again, the best way of fixing the mind on Krishna, or any form of Ishvara, is the mantra, the mantra of that form of Ishvara. Verse 15, thus continually disciplining himself, the yogin whose mind is subdued goes to nirvana, to supreme peace, to union with me. So two things here. Nirvana, of course, this term is not necessarily a Buddhist term. It's a term that's shared by all of the schools. Later on, it becomes associated with Buddhism, and then the Hindu traditions stop using it and tend to use terms like moksha and mukti. But in these early days, it was a shared term. A lot of this vocabulary is shared. There's not the same kind of sectarian specifics that emerges later. So that's one thing. And what does it mean to union with me? Well, that's a question then that you have massive differences on the Vedanta traditions. In Advaita Vedanta, that means the Atman merges into Brahman, it loses its individuality. But in the Vaishnava Vedanta traditions, the Atman retains its individuality, and union is a union of devotion and bhakti and love and relationship between two individuals who, in the one sense, are one, because Krishna says, this is all my prakriti, higher and lower, and the Atman is also my prakriti. So there's a difference there, but there's a oneness and a difference, and so different Vedanta schools call that oneness and difference by different names. The Krishnamacharya tradition, the Ramanuja tradition, calls it Vishishta Advaita, differentiated non-duality. And then we have terms like Dvaita, Advaita, Bheda, Bheda, Achintya, Bheda, Bheda, and so forth. So this is an issue that the Vedanta schools differ. What does this union with me mean? It's understood very, very, very differently. And we don't have time to go into that. Perhaps another discussion. We can look at some of those ways that basically we're talking about what's the relationship between Atman and Brahman, and what's the relationship between Brahman and Ishvara. Are they one and the same thing, and so forth. That discussion we'll have to save for another day. So going back to our citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ practice, verse 16, yoga is not eating too much, nor is it not eating at all. This is the middle path of Buddhism. Again, it becomes the middle path in Buddhism, but it has a shared context before it becomes sort of reified into the into a sort of one of the formulations in Buddhism. But the idea of not eating too much, not eating too little, it was shared amongst many yogis in the forests and in the moksha seekers of ancient India before they became reified into sects. So yoga is not eating too much, nor is it not eating at all, and not the habit of sleeping too much, and not keeping awake either, right? Because there were radical ascetics, including the Buddha before he became enlightened. Radical ascetic. You read his story, the Buddha said, he scratched his stomach and he touched his backbone. That's how little flesh he had from his radical non-eating. And he would scratch his head and his hair fell out. He would bite something, his teeth fell out because he was so malnourished. So that was pre-enlightenment Buddha, and then that's when he comes to the middle path. So that type of radical asceticism was standard. In fact, the Buddha, his early associates, they had names like Ramputta. There wasn't a sense of Buddhist Hindu. They were moksha seekers in the forest. They didn't have these labels that we now apply. They would have been associated with charismatic teachers, no doubt, and there would have been groups of them. It wasn't sort of... So anyway, so some of them were radical performers of radical tapas, what Patañjali calls tapas, austerity. But Gīta's not promoting that, even in its jhana yoga section. Forget about the karma yoga section, but even in its representation of this forest yoga, it's not recommending radical asceticism, at least not in verse 16. In fact, elsewhere it says that they're demons who actually torment their body. They're asuras. But there it's talking about those who do tapas to get siddhi, mystic power, which Patañjali refers to in the 4th chapter, verse 1, that mystic powers can be attained by tapas. In fact, the great demons of Indian folklore, like Ravana and Hiranyakasipu, the great demons, how do they get their powers? How did Ravana get so powerful even the celestials couldn't mess with him? Tapas. They were doing something that looked like yoga, and mind control and intense tapas, but their intentions, they had no interest in the Atman at all. And just by the way, I think that's why Patanjali talks about the siddhis in the 3rd chapter. I always, when I wrote the book, this didn't come to me. It came to me afterwards, after it had been published. Otherwise I'd have run in and added it. But why does Patanjali spend a third of of the book, or a quarter of the book, talking about siddhis. Then he says, but they're of no real interest to yogis. Well, why bother mentioning them? Well, I think perhaps one reason is because there were lots of people in the forest who were doing something that looked like yoga, sitting and stilling their breath and intensely focusing their mind, but they had no interest in Atman at all. They were interested in powers. So anyway, Krishna's not advocating that. Verse 17, certainly not here. For him who is moderate in food and diversion, whose actions are disciplined, who is moderate in sleep and waking, yoga destroys all sorrow. Verse 18, when he's absorbed in the self alone, with controlled mind, free from longing, free from desires, sarva kama, then he's said to be a yogi, yukta iti uchyate. Verse 19, we have this nice metaphor of the lamp in a windless place. Doesn't flicker the flame. That's the mind of the yogi. And then verse 20, how do you see the self? This is a beautiful verse. When the mind comes to rest, restrained by the practice of yoga, when beholding the self by the self, he is content in the self. How does the self see itself? How does one have a realization of the self? The mind can't realize it, right? Right from the Upanishads, they are clear. Mind doesn't reach it, words don't describe it. The intellect can't grasp it. So how is it to be known then? Right? All our instruments of knowledge that we use to know the world, none of those are any good in this type of yoga. They have to all be closed down, basically tossed away. So then, how is the self to be known if our conventional instruments of knowledge and attaining knowledge and perception, if they are of no avail? Well, atmanam atmane atmana, the self is to be known in itself, through itself, by itself. And that's Patanjali's drashtu swarupa vastana. It abides in its own nature. It cannot be known by the mind. The mind can know of it, can have a concept of it, can infer its existence through logic. The Nyaya school will suggest there must be an Atman using logic, but it can't be experienced other than in itself, through itself, by itself. So that's verse 20. Paschan atmani tushyate yat atmana atmanam, through the self, in itself. So then we'll skip around a bit. Having attained this, verse 22, no greater gain can he imagine. Established in this, he is not moved even by profound sorrow. So then, in fact, verse 21 we skipped over, talks of the infinite bliss and happiness. First of the sattvic mind, and then of the Atman itself. There's two types of happiness. There's the mind when it's completely and utterly in a state of sattva, and the nature of sattva, Gītā's going to say later on, is happiness. So that's the prakritic happiness, but the ultimate happiness is within the Atman itself, which Vedanta would say the nature of the Atman, even though we can't describe it, as we said before. Typically there's lots of negatives, it's not this, not this, but if you do want to say something, then Sat, it is, you can say that much. Chit, and it's conscious. And then the Vedantins throw in, well, it's Ananda, it's blissful. And it's different from any other kind of bliss. So there are two types of bliss, the sattvic mind, a type of happiness, and the bliss of the Atman itself. Anyway, so here we have verse 23, the third definition of yoga, yet another one. Let this dissolution of union with pain be known as yoga. Tadvidyad dukkha sanyoga viyogam yoga samjnitam. Let that be known as yoga, the separation from pain. So that's kind of like the real base level 1 definition of yoga, is it frees you from pain, that much at least. But it's important to say that, because without an awareness of pain, of dukkham, why would one take up the yoga path in the first place? That's why the Buddha has the sarvam dukkham as the first truth. The path is the fourth truth. Before you want to take a path, you have to want to go somewhere, and you have to want to leave where one presently is. Well, the path means I don't want to be here, I want to be somewhere else. So therefore, as long as if we're happy in the world, things are hunky-dory, then why take an arduous path of yoga? So therefore, the first step of the yogic journey is a sense of that one dukkham, that one is unfulfilled or somehow frustrated. So then Krishna then, given that, he says, so yoga is that which takes you beyond suffering. In verse 23, he defines yoga as that which takes us, let that be known as yoga, that practice which takes us away from suffering. So, so then verse 24, we have abandoning all those desires whose origins lie in intention, right? Desire nothing other than memories of past sense experiences, and if they're pleasant, they become desires. So, and then they arise in the mind, and then one makes an intention of fulfilling them. And so Krishna says, give them all up. They lie. The intention is, let me find happiness through my body mind. How do I do that? Well, I'll go in my memory. I'll pull out some skaras of things that worked for me in the past, that felt good in the past, and that's what a desire is. And Krishna says in 24, give that up completely, every one of them, and control the senses. Okay, we're going to have to speed up a bit. So verse 25, little by little he should come to rest with the intellect firmly held, right? Buddhya, citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ. So that's dhyana, right? That's dharana, is to hold on. Patañjali is going to say, ekadeshe, fix the mind, holding it on one place. Tanata, drawing it out, right? It's Patañjali language. He should not think of anything. Verse 26, I love this verse. Okay, let me read the Sanskrit. Yato nischarati manas chanchalam asthiram tatastato niyamyetat atmanyeva vasham nayet. Wherever the mind wanders, bring it back. Wanders, bring it back. From wherever, literally, wherever it goes. The mind, chanchalam asthiram, because it's asthiram, it's not fixed, like asthiram, we know stiram, right? Asana, stiram, sukham. But the mind is asthiram, it's not fixed, and it's chanchalam, it's always flickering. So yato nischarati, wherever it goes, tatastato niyamyeta, from that place, bring it back. Atmanyeva vasham nayat. One should bring it back under the control of the self. That's meditation. Dhyana is nothing other than that. Dhyana is nothing other than the effort. Mind goes off, bring it back. Goes off, bring it back. Nothing mystical about it. Nothing magical about it. It's hard work. It's a practice, and that's what it is. And Krishna doesn't say if the mind wanders. He says when it wanders. Anybody that practices meditation will know very well. The mind wanders instantly. So the yogi, verse 27, whose mind is peaceful, passions are calmed, free of evil, has become one with Brahman. Again, what does that mean, one with Brahman? Understood very differently. In the theistic, monotheistic traditions, oneness is a oneness of two individuals, is a oneness of love and relationship. In Advaita Vedanta, it's a literal, actual oneness, an annihilation of the individualism. So attains the highest bliss. And again, 28, again, that happiness beyond end, right? Sukham atyantam. Or the problem with all the happiness, the body, mind, avidya happiness, is they have a beginning and an end. Patanjali says parinama, they're always changing. So this bliss is atyanta, is like my sneeze, has a beginning and an end. So pleasures in the prakritic realm are of that nature, and therefore the yogi is not interested. The yogi is like anybody else, seeking happiness, like any other embodied being, but has determined that the happinesses of prakriti are temporal, and there's always a price tag, there's always a sort of hidden price tag. Verse 28 and 27, however, tell us that this bliss of the Atman is atyanta, is eternal. It's inherent in the Atman itself. So then verse 29, when one attains this vision of the self, one also sees the self in all other beings, and therefore sees everybody equally. Previous verse, a beautiful verse of where Krishna says, that he sees a Brahmin, a dog and a dog eater as the same, the highest in the social hierarchy and the lowest. He sees them all as Atman. It's a beautiful vision of the accomplished yogi, the realized yogi. Okay. So then he so then Arjuna says, well, this yoga that you've defined, and this is verse 33, as samatvam, right, evenness of mind, Arjuna says, I don't see how it's possible. He doesn't reject it. He just says it doesn't seem attainable because the mind is chanchala. It's the same word. It's flickering. So, and he goes on in 34. It's unstable. It's turbulent. It's powerful. It's more difficult to control than the wind. And this is a nice verse 35. If you want to connect it to Patañjali, where Krishna says, yes, it's difficult, but it can be done by vairagya abhyasa. And that's the definition of nirodhaḥ in Patañjali. What is nirodhaḥ? Abhyasa vairagya abhyam tan nirodhaḥ. So the same two words, abhyasa vairagya, we find here in 635. Arjuna's question is, it's too hard. How am I going to do it? It's like the wind. How do you control the wind? And Krishna here says, it's hard, but it can be done. And how do you do it? Vairagya. You cultivate detachment from the world. How do you do that? You see that actually all endeavors end up somehow frustrating in some sort of way, or at least unfulfilling. So that's vairagya, to cultivate viraga, virajas. Viraga, raga is a desire, right? Vairagya is a state of vai, without raga. And abhyasa, you practice. How do you practice? Well, the previous verse, yato nischarati manas chanchalam asthiram tatastato niyam yetad atmanyeva vasham nayat. Wherever it goes, bring it back. That's the abhyasa. It's nothing other than that. It's nothing esoteric. It's just a abhyasa. It's a practice. It's a daily practice, and over the years, one starts to get better at it. So, we're almost then at the end of our time. So then Arjuna asks this great question. Well, what happens if I? And this is 635. Then 637:38. Arjuna says, well, what if I start and I don't finish? Then aren't I a loser? Right? I start the path of yoga. I do some tapas. I do some vairagya. So I sort of start to give up my attachment to the things of the world, but I didn't get this great bliss of Brahman that everyone's talking about. So I don't get one or the other, like a cloud that gets broken up. It's not, the little bit of cloud wanders off from the big patch of cloud. What happens to it? It's not cloud anymore. It just evaporates into nothingness. It's not sky. What is it? So if I take up the path of yoga and I don't finish, well, I didn't get to even try to enjoy this world like the Vedic ritualists are trying to do, but I didn't get this bliss of Brahman like the yogis keep talking about. So I'm a loser then. I got nothing. So this is the question. It's a great question, and the subtext of the question, and this is I'm inferring this, is kind of like, since I don't think I can finish in this life, why bother trying? Why start a practice that I can't finish, right? And this might be a question that some of us sometimes ask, our minds ask. And then you get these beautiful verses where Krishna says, you don't worry, if you fall from the path, it's probably, weaknesses or whatever, you'll get to go to a celestial realm to burn up some of your whatever desires are there. And then you come back down and you take birth. And these are verses, you stay there for a long time, verse 41, in these sort of the realms of the meritorious, the svargas. And then you come back and you take birth in a very good family. Either a very good family that's pious, and, well, the word he uses is shrimatam, I think. Yeah, shrimatam and shuchinam. It's shuchi, it's a pure family, sattvic, pious, favorably disposed to spirituality. That would be shuchi. And shrimatam, with resources, so there's no hustle, there's no sort of, you don't have to hustle for just to make ends meet. So either one takes birth in a good, pious, spiritually favorable family, or verse 42, you come back and take birth in a family of yogis. And he says that eta hi durlabhataram, that's very rare. Obviously, if you take birth in a family of yogis, then the little baby, from all the samskaras going into that baby's mind from the moment, even in the conception and even in the womb, and certainly after birth, is going to be yogically flavored. The conversations in the household, the environment in the household, the activities of the mother and father. If they're yogis, they're going to be meditating, they're going to be practicing tapas and svadhyaya, there's going to be study, and the child will be growing up. All the samskaras going into the child's mind will be of that sort. So that's considered to be, at least in this verse, Krishna says that is Durlabha taram. That's very rare. That's more rare. Tara, more rare than the previous, than just taking birth in a good family. So we're almost at the end here, and in verse 43, then Krishna says, and then he picks up the same knowledge he had from the past life. In other words, the question is, what if I start, don't finish, and I fall? Say I got halfway along the path, fell. Krishna says, okay, then you go to the celestial realm, come down, take birth, good birth. But then you pick up the practice from where you left off. That means that at an early age, that child is going to be attracted to the practices of yoga and able to concentrate the mind, starting at the same place that person left off. So nothing is lost. Unlike other things, we lose from one life to the next. We have some skill in this life, we die, we don't necessarily have that skill in the next life, right? If I'm a violinist, I don't get born, except in rare cases, maybe like Beethoven, where, something may activate from a past life, a child prodigy, but in most cases, one doesn't reactivate skills from a past life. There might be some inclination, but yoga, you start exactly where you left off, according to verse 44 and 43 of the 6th chapter. And Krishna says, and then one is almost forced along the practice, meaning the samskaras will activate from the past life and they will just rush into the mind, and just that person will just, even without really thinking about it, or maybe not even studying or really knowing what he or she's doing, is automatically finds themselves engaged in the practices. That would be one way of reading verse 44. So almost against his will is the language. The Sanskrit is purva abhyasena, from the purva abhyasa, right? Abhyasa purva, the previous practice, tena, kriyatehi avasho. Avasho. Vash is to control. Avasho means almost sort of spontaneously. That's a nice way of saying avasha. Not against his will, because that sounds impositional, but ava is spontaneous interest and attraction and inclination and ability to do yoga. Ability meaning whatever ability had been developed in a past life, that same ability just reactivates. So then I'd like to finish this discussion then with, again, I want to bring it back to Bhakti because I don't want us to get lost, again, I want to wrap this up, but let's read two more verses, verse 46. Oh, well, actually, verse 45, and Krishna says, and then through many births, verse 45, one slowly works, each birth becoming more, the mind becomes purer and purer by the practices, and eventually, and he says actually many births. So the Sanskrit, aneka janma, aneka, not eka, not one, aneka, more than one. So aneka, so it's not necessarily going to happen in one birth. Aneka janma, through many births, one eventually becomes samsiddha. Siddha becomes perfected. So then, last two verses of the chapter, 46 and 47, let's read the Sanskrit. Verse 46, tapasvibhyo dhiko yogi, jnanibhyo pi mato dhikaha, karmibhyoschadiko yogi, tasmat yogi bhavarjuna. That the yogi is tapasvibhyo, is better than the person who's doing tapas, right? And I mentioned there are plenty of people doing tapas who were doing tapas they wanted siddhi, or they wanted some other goal. But so the yogi is better than just someone doing tapas. The yogi may be doing tapas, but he's doing tapas to realize the Atman. So that's better than just doing tapas. That's the first line. Jnani bhyo pi mato dhikaha. And it's better than just someone who's just studying, the jnani, who knows. And maybe the Vedantins that's not quite right. But, someone who's just cultivating knowledge for the sake of knowledge, right? For learning or for prestige or, So yogi's better than just someone cultivating knowledge, because the yogi's trying to realize that knowledge. So line 2 says the yogi's better than the jnani, and certainly better than the karmi. The karmis are the Vedic ritualists who are doing stuff that looks religious, that's authorized by sacred texts, but it's actually just perpetuating ignorance, because it's based on getting stuff for the body-mind, which means it's based on an identity of thinking I am body-mind, and therefore my body-mind needs this, that, and the other, and doing all these rituals to get this, that, and the other. So the yogi is better than the Vedic ritualist, which here the karmi is probably referring to the Vedic ritualist. Tasmad yogi bhavarjuna, therefore be a yogi, Arjuna. And the last verse then is the one that I want to leave you with in terms of this section. yoginam api sarvesham, and out of all the yogis, right, who are better than the tapas people and the karmis and the jnanis, and all the yogis, madgateyan antaratmanan, the one who has gone to me with his mind, has absorbed his mind in me, whose mind is absorbed in me. Madgata antara atmanan. Atmana here means the mind is internally is contemplating me. Shradhavan bhajate yomam. Bhajate, who does bhakti. The word bhakti comes from the root bhaj. So bhajate is the verbal form of bhakti, the one who does bhakti to me. Shradhavan, with faith. Same yukta tama mata. He is the best of the yuktas. He's the best of the yogis. So there's a number of hierarchical or comparative statements in the Gītā. In all of them, bhakti is the highest. The performer of bhakti, either the practice of bhakti is the highest. Beginning of chapter 12, you can check that. This verse, the practitioner of bhakti is the highest of all yogis. So the Gītā is very clear that bhakti is the path of action is better than the path of forest yoga. That's something that he dispenses with in the beginning of the text, establishes that. But then we will find, if we had more time to read the rest of the text, but of those active in the world, the bhakti is the highest. And I would like to just then finish with 2 bhakti verses, so that we get a sense of what is this bhakti then. Now we know what meditational yoga is, fixing the mind, exactly what Patañjali says it is. We know what karma yoga is, which the Gītā is introducing for the first time, or at least in its own frame of reference. It's re-establishing a lost tradition, but to all intents and purposes it's something new at the time. That's karma yoga. What is this bhakti? Well, the Gītā mostly establishes bhakti as the highest, speaks of the bhakti yoga as the highest, yogi as the highest. It doesn't tell us too much about how to do bhakti. And the text to go to for that is, of course, the Bhagavata Purana in the Krishna tradition. Of course, there are other bhakti traditions. In the Shiva tradition, you have the Shiva Purana, and the Devi tradition, you have the Devi Mahatmya. But we're looking at the Gītā now, and that's Krishna is saying that he is that Ishvara and speaking about bhakti to himself. So the text, if one's interested in looking at the what's the nitty-gritty of bhakti? Who are the role models? What are the practices? What are the attitudes? Then the text to read for that is the Bhagavata Purana, which I think now is becoming more and more readily available. It's being translated more and more, and so forth. So, but the Gītā itself doesn't say too much, but it does say a couple of things, and I'd like to leave you with those verses, if I may, and that would be in the 9th chapter. And I think this will be a good place to part company. And we'll go to 9:20 something. So a quick look. Here we are, 9:14 and 15, and these will finish our discussion here. What is this bhakti? And here 9:14. Satatam kirtayanto mam. Always doing kirtan. This is one way of keeping Krishna or Ishvara in the mind, is kirtan. Having the mantra, constantly singing it out loud and congregationally. That's kirtan tends to be congregational. Put it in the mind. Satatam, all the time. Yatantascha citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ, still following the vows, the yamas and niyamas. It's not that bhakti is a shortcut. It's not some kind of born-again Krishnaism. It's still a yogic practice. Yamas, niyamas, all of that applies. So that's line 2. Yatantascha, striving, struggling. Citta-vṛitti-nirodhaḥ, with fixed vows. Namasyantas chamam bhaktya, always doing honor, namas, to me with bhakti. Always honoring, and often this is associated with pujas and deity worship. Nitya yukta upasate, always yukta, always in a state of yoga, like the classical yogis, always still mind control, still fixing the mind, but bhakti means fixing the mind on Ishvara, on Krishna, rather than on the Atman, or rather than on Dharma for Dharma's sake. Okay, so karma yoga is fixing the mind on Dharma for Dharma's sake, free of attachment, but that's the practice. Acting without, and always monitoring that one's not becoming attached. Jnana yoga is keeping the Atman samskara dominant in the mind, right? I am Atman, and repeating the great Upanishadic Mahavakyas, right? Tattvamasi, you are that. Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. That's the practice in jnana, keeping the jnana samskaras in the mind, right? Patanjali practices nirodha, right? So the prominent samskara is the nirodha samskara, nirodha, stilling everything else. But bhakti, the much more of an active practice, but the samskaras are active as a vrittis, but all focused on Krishna. So Krishna can be kept in the mind through the stories of the incarnations, through kirtan, through japa, their mantra, repeating the mantra in the mind. And through puja, sort of worshipping of the deity. If we had more time, we could talk about what a deity is. But essentially, it's similar to the notion of transubstantiation in Catholicism, where the host becomes is no longer bread and water, but it's body and blood of Christ. So the deity becomes a pervaded divine presence. So finally, so that's bhakti. It's the satatam kirtayantama. And verse 15, I can't find it, but I remember the Sanskrit. Yad karoshi, yad ashnashi, yad jahoshi, dadasi yat tapasyasi kaunteya, tat kurusva madarpanam. Bhakti. Whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you offer, whatever tapas you perform, you do that madarpanam as an offering to Bhagavan. This is how it differs from karma yoga. Karma yoga, you do those things just purely duty for duty's sake, almost in a Confucian type of mode. Whereas in bhakti, one's active in the world, right? Again, the text is promoting action in the world, whether at the karma yoga type, but it's definitely saying the most ultimate, highest form of action is bhakti, but it's still promoting, in either case, it's promoting action. The difference between bhakti yoga and karma yoga is that in bhakti, everything is done as an offering. And okay, so that's it. Basically, if we want to think of 4 practices, I'll just repeat this one more time. The principal samskaras of the mind in Jnana Yoga is I am Atman, I'm not body-mind. That's the principal mental cultivation, that's the abhyasa, that's the practice. And it tends to focus a lot on, in the Vedanta tradition, on study of the Upanishads and the great sayings, and internalizing them and repeating them and contemplating them. That's Jnana Yoga, that's the practice, keeping the Atma Samskara foremost. Foremost samskara of Karma Yoga is that, plus what is my duty, what is my duty, what is my duty, in every context. What is duty call, right? Not what do I want, not what results am I going to get. Always monitoring that desire doesn't creep in, and that's the practice. And am I doing this simply because of duty, or is my ego intruding? That's the practice, duty for duty's sake. So it's a combination of the jnana samskaras we just discussed, but in addition to that, because it's taking those into the world, it's called buddhi yukta, also called buddhi yoga, taking those into the world, and the main concern is, am I doing duty for duty's sake? Okay, that's the main samskara. Patañjali yoga, which we discussed, chapter 6 here, what's the main samskara? Nirodha. The one samskara that stills everything else until it has nothing left to do, and then it too dissolves, as Patanjali puts it. Then the seer then there's nothing to distract the seer anymore, and therefore the seer can swarupe vastanam, abide in its own nature. So the dominant samskara in the Patanjalian, which the Gītā calls jnana yoga practice, is nirodha samskara. Okay, so 3 different samskaras in 3 different practices, and finally bhakti. What is the dominant samskara? Is Krishna. And how do we keep Krishna in the mind? Through thinking of the stories of Krishna's leelas and pastimes, through repeating the mantras of Krishna, through kirtan, through pujas, and in these sorts of bhakti specific ways. And of course, those who worship other forms of Ishvara, the same would apply for Shiva and the goddess. So I hope I didn't talk too fast, but I was trying to cram a lot in, and thank you for your attention.